Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another call for Community Solutions hosted by the Forbes Funds and GPNP. Whether you're a returning attendee or joining us for the first time, we're grateful for the time and energy you're bringing to this conversation. Each week, this space serves as a collaborative hub where nonprofit leaders, funders, policymakers, and community members can connect, exchange ideas, and navigate challenges together. For those who may be new to these calls, we started this initiative in March 2020 as a direct response to the evolving needs of our nonprofit sector. Since then, the Forbes Funds and GPNP have facilitated over 5,683 community-driven meetings with more than 48,721 participants, reinforcing the power of collective action. Your engagement keeps this space meaningful, and whether you're here for policy updates, sector insights, or to share challenges and solutions, we're here to support you. To drive meaningful impact, we align our work with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which provide a global lens to addressing our local issues. Also, the social determinants of health, ensuring holistic, people-centered solutions, as well as the 8 returns model, which helps us measure success beyond financial metrics to include social, cultural, and community well-being. These frameworks help us strategically align efforts across sectors and ensure the outcomes of our work are measurable and meaningful. To make the most of today's session, we ask you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name and your organization, any questions you might have on your mind, and to turn on your camera if possible. Seeing each other fosters connection on this call. And again, if you have any questions related to our speaker or to the presentation or anything that's on your mind, again, please feel free to drop that in the chat and we will circle back to that. And finally, please be sure to take our post-call poll. Your feedback helps us to shape future calls. All right, today we will be hearing from Monique Curry-Mims, publisher and editor-in-chief of Generocity, and principal and founder of Civic Capital Consulting. Monique will introduce Generocity, a dynamic platform dedicated to social sustainability, featuring insightful stories, expert analysis, and updates on the pillars of social impact: inclusivity, justice, community voice, and government responsiveness. She'll share how Generocity is expanding its reach to the Pittsburgh community, highlight new partnerships, and preview upcoming stories and projects. As principal and publisher at Civic Capital Consulting, sorry guys. You can't seem to move there we go. As principal and publisher at Civic Capital Consulting, an international social impact firm, Monique Curry-Mims works with social impact leaders to develop innovative strategies that facilitate, educate, and inform leaders on how to fulfill their mission and purpose in alignment with the needs of the communities they support. With over 20 years of experience managing and consulting with nonprofit organizations and foundations, Monique helps philanthropists articulate their vision by exploring the core of their mission, vision, and values. Through a facilitative process, she works with her clients to identify the specific social issues they want to address and the strategies they can employ to create a lasting legacy for their organizations and families and make an impact in their community. As part of Civic Capital's content division, Civic Content, Monique co-hosts the Beyond Philanthropy podcast, a monthly podcast focused on upending traditional and institutional practices of philanthropy. Monique is also the publisher and editor-in-chief of Generocity, a solutions-focused social impact media outlet that takes a critical look at the impact of funding, programs, and solutions in our communities. Civic Content's goal is to strengthen social impact through advocacy, community voices, and building bridges between communities through media and journalism. We're so glad to have you here today, Monique. I'm going to pass it over to you. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Monique, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I'm first going to apologize because my internet is unstable. It keeps telling me I've closed all my windows, but if I freeze, forgive me for my technical difficulties today. I want to thank the Forbes Fund for having me today and to Craig, who's also on the call, who has been an integral part of this partnership. I wanted to kind of start a little bit back and just talk about generosity as where it started and where it is now, and how we formed this partnership. So, Generosity has been around since 2009. It was founded by a woman named Sandra Baldino, who originally wanted to highlight nonprofits that might be more grassroots startup, a little more unknown. Um, and it was just supposed to be kind of like this highlight site, but it turned into this media site that was something that she was not prepared to run. And in 2015, she sold it to Technically Media. I think there's a Technically Pittsburgh, but she sold it to Technically Media, who, if you guys know, technically is about the business of technology, about startups and how they operate, what's happening in the sector. So they thought that they can do that for the nonprofit sector. And it became more like, hey, I got this grant. Let's talk about all the good things we're going to do with it, how our business operates, what our mission is. In 2023, I acquired it, Civic Capital acquired it. And we acquired it with the thought that let's take it a step further. Let's talk about the impact in communities, right? So throughout the journey, we talked about here are the nonprofits. Now we talked about what nonprofits do. Let's talk about the impact they now have. In Philadelphia, and I'm sure in Pittsburgh, a lot has been happening throughout the years, not just more recently. And there are a lot of dollars that go into communities, that go into nonprofits, but sometimes we're not necessarily seeing all the change on the ground. And that's not necessarily a fault of the nonprofit. Life is lifing, right? Between policies that are enacted, whether for good or for bad for us, whether it's something that's going to impact the way that we operate, or reduce the need for our operations, or just things like COVID and pandemics, or tariffs that are happening. The things are just happening. So it's like, what is actually needed? And a lot of times, and I know, like background, I started a nonprofit, ran it for 10 years. I was director of development of another nonprofit for 5 years. And then I launched my consulting company in 2018, and I've been running it ever since. So I've gone through the journey of nonprofit startup grassroots to a more successful one, and running that one to now helping nonprofits and foundations. So I understand how we operate as a sector. And I also know that a lot of times, sometimes we're too smart for our own good, right? We all have degrees or we have experience, and we're looking at our solutions and our mission from our eyes, and maybe not necessarily the community's eyes, or understanding all of the different things that they are experiencing. So with Generosity, our goal was to provide some insight, right, on what is happening in our communities from our community. So all of our stories are community driven in one way or another. We host community newsrooms where last year we would partner with a nonprofit on a Saturday, and we would spend the day there, allowing for community members to come in and speak with us around issues they were having in their community, solutions that they have, and also allow for them to tell their own stories, either interviewing with one of our journalists, or we would have video activation stations where they can record it themselves. And that would help guide our stories throughout the year. This year, we're still doing them a little less often, but we're doing them thematically. So having a panel discussion, as well as then also having the newsroom. So again, we're still driving our content from community voice. And I think that's what's different about us. Philadelphia has a lot of different media outlets. A lot of them, we have the Inquirer, which is our bigger one. And it's like, what's breaking right now? Let's get this out the door. What's happening? But coming from a more solutions focus, we really want to dive into what the issue is, what the solution is. Is it the right solution? How has that solution actually impacted the community for better, for worse? Are there other instances where this has been implemented in other cities and other areas where we can learn from that and bring it back to us as a learning mechanism? So that's just a little bit of background on Generosity. When the election happened, yeah, the election happened, and just thinking about what some of the promises he made, during his campaign, understanding the promises and the way that he introduced policies the last campaign and last presidency, knowing that he had a plan last time that kind of got derailed by COVID and that he was more prepared this time, especially with Project 2025. So just understanding all of those things, I thought that it might be advantageous for us as a community to come together. So expanding to Pittsburgh, the thought was, what can we as a community statewide learn from each other so that way we are better for the people that we serve? How can we talk about what's happening across state? Because our readers for Generosity, they're nonprofit leaders, they're foundation leaders, they're government leaders. They're the people who are putting dollars and programs and policies in communities. So if we are all on the same page, if we're all trying to understand that the people that we serve are not much different and they're more alike, just because you're on the opposite sides of the state or even in the middle of the state, right? They might show up a little bit differently, but we all have some of the same needs. How can we present those through a narrative that we can help to share to our politicians? How can we come together to enact policy change? How can we educate the people who are putting dollars in our pockets and policies in our communities? So I just hopped on LinkedIn with that kind of understanding and started actually connecting with either journalists or organizations that I felt were kind of leaders in the community, that had an overarching understanding of what was happening in the community. And I reached out to Olivia Benson at the Forbes Fund, was like, hey, this is what we're doing. And I actually had asked for a referral, like, hey, do you know of anybody that we should be speaking with? Someone who can help us tell this story in Pittsburgh, help us to connect the stories across the state. And she said, hey, we have a whole department here. Like, how can we partner together? So, that conversation grew from Forbes Fund coming in as a writing partner, and Craig has graciously decided to pick up that mantle and join me in this crazy effort. And he is the Forbes Fund contributor at Generosity now. And just through conversations with Olivia, we also talked about these Monday morning calls and maybe even turning one of them once a month into a turnpike conversation where we're able to kind of have a statewide conversation around what is happening, what needs are. I'm not sure, how you guys are, wearing or weathering over there, but, Philadelphia lost around $8 million in federal funding. Our nonprofits here are very heavily reliant on federal funding. We don't have a lot of foundation dollars here. Our foundations are really small. We have maybe 2 or 3 large foundations. One is Pew, and Pew is Pew. We have William Penn, which is the other bigger one. And I think maybe after that might be Hamilton Family Foundation, but we don't have a lot of big philanthropy here. So it is overly reliant on federal and even state dollars, which are shrinking at the moment. So a lot of nonprofits are kind of thinking about closing and downsizing. I know one nonprofit had 3 locations and they've closed one location, downsized one location, and actually considering closing that and just putting everything into one. And what's interesting is that Philadelphia is very much a city of neighborhoods. And because of different things, a lot of youth don't like going into other communities. So they were very intentional about creating sites in different communities so that kids can be safe and didn't have to travel at night or in areas where they didn't feel unsafe. And now they're having to rethink that because of funding, and rethinking how they provide a safe space for youth now, especially as a gun violence intervention reduction nonprofit, right? So I've been babbling and I don't like babbling. So that's just a little bit of background on, what we're doing, what we hope. We hope that we're able to provide some insights for you guys as well. The idea, and I think the link is in the chat for Generosity. The idea is that, we also would like to help Pittsburgh, right? This isn't just about, right now, it's about, what can we do across state. Craig wrote an article recently around the library's infrastructure and how just integral it is to the civic infrastructure there in Pittsburgh. And that came out of some library issues that we're having here in Philadelphia, right? And you guys seem to have a stronger lock and focus on your libraries there that we probably, our government needs to think about here. But also, what are things as the nonprofit sector in Pittsburgh? What is it that you guys need? What is it that you want? We are open for contributions for you to write about the needs in your community, and or even to have us focus on things that are special or things that are needed in your community. So we are just here as a resource. And I think the last thing I'll say is that, the only way that I think that people can be successful is through collaboration. So this is not necessarily us coming in and just, being the next news outlet in Pittsburgh. This is about partnering with organizations here and just providing a platform where we can uplift the things that you guys are doing. We have sections on our website where we actually can dedicate pages to organizations where you can have your own page and your own content can exist there. So this isn't about us owning content. This is about republishing, uplifting, and just showing that we have a strong community that's really working to strengthen our communities across the state. So I'm going to stop there and ask if there's any questions, thoughts, comments.
Thank you so much, Monique. I'm looking in the chat here. And as we were discussing before, I'm very excited to share that we'll be having more conversations about this throughout the year. Um, so anything that comes up after this, we can also discuss and kind of shape our discussions in the future. But this call was really meant to help us all understand exactly where this partnership came from and how it can help us to, reinforce statewide communication and collaboration to better deliver our missions. So thank you so much, Monique. We have a question from
Mhm.
Jennifer in the chat. Could you please talk more about sharing a page on your website, what agencies cost process? Thank you.
You're welcome. So if we are republishing content, there is no cost. Um, we just ask that it is mission aligned, and we also ask that it's not self-serving. I wanted to pull up a page. I will say, because we are solutions oriented now, we do not focus directly on organizations. We focus on issues and solutions. So if a nonprofit pitches us a story idea, like, oh, my organization is doing, food drives, and we want to talk about our food drive. Will do a story on food drives or food insecurity. Um, and we will include that organization as one of the sources. In the chat, I just placed a page to Community Connections. So Community Connections is a video series that's created by a woman named Katrina Pratt Roebuck. She operates an organization called Uplift Me, and she's uplifting stories of community leaders. So this page is her page. She sends us the link to her videos, and she sends us the thumbnail that's just like highlighted for each page. And every Tuesday when we get them, or when we get them every Tuesday, we publish them. And then they also go into our newsletter. So the content is uplifted on our site on a dedicated page. And every Wednesday, we send out a newsletter. The newsletter has our featured story for the week. It has any content such as this, community content like this. We have a job bank, so our job postings that are currently relevant are listed there. If you're able to create a profile on our website where you can list your mission and your guide star profile and your contact information. And when you do that, you're able to list press releases and annual reports. So if you do post anything there, that also gets posted onto our website, onto our newsletter as well. So our newsletter is kind of like here is what's latest and greatest from our community on our website, all in one place every Wednesday in your inbox. And the process is just connecting with me to make sure that, or with our editor, our managing editor who couldn't be here, to make sure that the content is just in alignment with what we're trying to produce. And then, once we are okay with that, it's just getting on a cadence schedule where you're sending us the content. And again, we're posting it every Tuesday. Tuesday is our day to post partner content. And we also do Tuesday takeovers where we do allow for community partners to take over our social media or send out dedicated emails. There is a cost for that. But yes, I hope that answered your question.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I did want to ask us to back up a little as well, because it was very helpful when we were chatting before the call to sort of situate why this partnership and this kind of initiative is so powerful. Um, as I mentioned, many of us on the call are nonprofit leaders. We're very focused on giving those services, those direct services that we've, you know, signed up to deliver. And it's very hard to think outside of the box sometimes and be innovative and collaborative and understand how these things work. So would you mind, you did share in so many words, but would you mind reviewing again um, why this is so important to, for example, be working? And I think this is really an important reason why we've adopted the term social impact sector is because it is so far beyond nonprofit work. And
Mhm.
this is a very good example of where, again, this is so please, if you wouldn't mind highlighting why this partnership is important.
Yeah. So one, I think that just in a local community, being able to connect the dots between all of the different facets, right? Like I said, like government puts policies out, they actually also put budgeting dollars out as well. The way that they determine what they're doing and when they determine it, it's going to impact the work that we do, right? Whether we now need to go get funding elsewhere, whether the communities that we serve are going to be in more dire need. So being able to have that conduit that says, here's what's actually happening when you make these decisions, or here's what's happening now that you're in the middle of this decision-making process for you to consider, from our community members, from our nonprofits who are experts on these topics. Um, and then when I think about just what is happening and how we can advocate together, when you think about, I mean, even though it still did get passed at the end, but when 9495 originally went to the floor in November, calls were put out across the country. Call your senator, call your representative, call, email. And it was able to be shot down the first time. Now, say they very quickly got it back together and pushed it back out the door that Friday. But then when the original cuts were being made, and Doge was like, "Oh, we're going to just cut off all this funding for this immediate need while we figure everything out. It's not going to touch anything." And when things started, people stopped getting funding and stopped getting dollars and Section 8 and HUD and all these things. It was the nonprofit sector, right? It was the social impact sector that was able to rally to say, no, this is what's happening to the people that we serve, to our community partners. This is actually happening. We need to bring this funding back. We have such a collection of data, qualitative and quantitative, from the work that we do, that we are the experts and we're not being considered, and we're also being impacted, right? Whether it's the new um, tax policy, 501(c)(3, I forget the number, for it's 9495, but it's in the new tax bill. They just, redid it, right? Like they're just it's just so many things that are happening right now that are impacting the people that we serve, that we have the information on, but we also have the information on how important we are. And I think that being able for everyone to come together locally, but then across the state, to be able to say to Harrisburg, this is what our communities need. We need you to fight for this bill. We need you to go against this bill. We need you to increase funding. We need you to whatever, right? Being able for us to come together and tell a narrative that actually makes sense. And I think that narratives at this moment are of the utmost importance, because it's going to explain to people the actual impact that's on the ground. A lot of people are just looking at numbers, but not being able to understand the truth behind the numbers is what is missing. And I think that that is why narratives are so important and why we need to come together across the state to say, no, it's not just this community. It's not just, it is us across the state as a whole. I thought that was okay.
Absolutely. And the danger of a single story, right? That's relevant here as well. So it's very great that we can paint a broader picture together. Wonderful. All right. Well, like I said, we were going to have more conversations coming up with Monique on these topics. Thank you so much for joining us, Monique. We'll share
You're
information
welcome.
in the e-newsletter on how to get involved and stay in touch in the loop with Generosity. And I'm going to switch over to our ecosystem and policy updates. Thank you,
Thank,
Monique.
thank you.
All right, Emily, you're going to
Thank
pass it over
you.
to you.
Yep, no worries. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, everyone. As Monique shared, there's a lot happening all the time in the policy and advocacy space. So one of the things that I do want to take a moment to do is ask anybody who has a second to add to the chat the types of policy updates you are looking for. Because in addition to being a fantastic communicator, writer, and the glue that is holding the partnership with Generosity together, Craig has been pulling reports on a daily basis, kind of scrubbing the internet for articles and pieces that are relevant to the nonprofit sector or social impact sector specifically. And that's something that does need to be narrowed as we kind of shift and prioritize in different areas just by nature of like all of the things that are happening and making sure that we can respond in a timely manner to those priorities. So I just wanted to pause very quickly and share, on the front end of the policy update, as we are continuing to pull those articles and just kind of keep a pulse on all of the items that are impacting the nonprofit ecosystem, that we're also responding to the most pressing issues for the folks who show up on a week-to-week basis for these calls. So with that, I'll go into ecosystem updates first and then pause for questions and then go to public policy as well. So in the ecosystem updates category from the Forbes Funds and GPNP, we have a lot of options and opportunities coming up. So first, the Equity and Action Summit. A couple of GPNB members who participated in our AI for Social Impact cohorts will be presenting with Adam Pulisic, Fred, and myself at our PCRG, our Pittsburgh Community Reinvestment Group Equity and Action Summit this Wednesday, June 4th. And our topic is the regenerative potential of AI for social good. This is going to be a really important 75-minute conversation about how our AI for social impact cohorts are opening opportunities for organizations to kind of recategorize how they build capacity leveraging AI, also looking at the different levels and ways that other types of capacity building can focus on equity, should focus on equity, are focusing on equity. And it's going to bring together about 600 leaders from the Southwest PA region, kind of broader Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia region as well. And so if you're looking for opportunities to meet like-minded professionals wrestling and grappling with some of these same issues on community development, this is a really great opportunity. And I'll ask my team to put that in the chat. Also, we hope to see you there, maybe for our presentation. The second item is our transformative leadership cohort kind of fundraiser and mixer. This isn't only for transformative leadership cohort members, but because we have been doing so much with TLC through golf as a metaphor for leadership and an opportunity to learn decision making on the fly, this is an opportunity to connect with Forbes Funds team, other members of the GPMP ecosystem on Thursday, June 26th from 5 to 8 p.m. at First Tee. And this is really just kind of a happy hour opportunity to get out onto the First Tee course, connect with our team and our partners at First Tee to learn about the cohort, but also just to kind of reconnect with folks as we're swinging into summer, because this is supposed to be something that is a reconnection kind of kickoff to the summer season with all of our programming and really just getting back in person with folks. It seems like the weather has been kind of gross the last week and a half. And there have been a lot of events that I've seen either kind of amended or canceled. So weather permitting, this is going to be our first foray into hosting in-person events leading into summit season, and we hope to see you there. There is a discount for GPNP members, so if you are curious about the status of your GPNP membership or want to connect to renew, please feel free to reach out to me. And I mentioned summit. Our save the date for the summit will be going out in a couple of weeks in your mailboxes. But as a kind of preview for this group, since you're on the call every week, our summit is going to be December 4th, 5th, and 6th at Nova Place. Please do not feel that that is full or 3 full days. December 4th is an evening event and gala that is going to be focusing on how nonprofits cannot do this work alone, whether it's advocacy, community organizing, really building collaboration, and kind of building on last summit's Gizmondi Awards. December 4th is going to be how nonprofits and philanthropy aren't doing this alone already, and how we can really celebrate what's been accomplished through the last 20 years of GPNP. Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania is also 20 years old this year, and so there have been a lot of shifts in how nonprofits really interact with philanthropy, and this is a retrospective and way to celebrate that. December 5th is also an evening event. No impact on your workday whatsoever, and it's going to be focusing very similarly how nonprofits are working together with elected officials, and how nonprofits aren't doing this alone, how we are working together not only at the state level or at the federal level with our representatives and senators, but also the conversations that are happening with municipal governments or through Congress of neighbor communities, and how the social impact sector really is beyond the nonprofit organizations that we work most closely with to understand those greater parts of community building that take different forms. And then finally, December 6th is going to be an all-day event, and that's the only one that is kind of a full day experience, and we scheduled it purposefully on a Saturday because the last summit we heard a lot of feedback from our especially direct service nonprofit organizations that made up, I think, a little over 60% of attendees, that it's really hard to step away from a full day of work in order to attend something like a summit, and making sure that we're taking the time, to be present, to think about workshopping these ideas. We'll be bringing in partners from, nationally and internationally, our global partners through our Global Leadership Lab, to make sure that this is a very worthwhile way to spend a Saturday at the beginning of December to talk about addressing the most critical challenges facing our region. And so that's going to be a 10 to 4, not too early, not too late, really designed to be what are the most impactful workshops that are going to be, driving the next 20 years of GPNP. And that's really why we're doing lead up events as well, because we don't want this to be, an academic conference or something that takes a ton of energy and time. We're going to be really intentional with how we spend the 4th, 5th, and 6th around specific things that are relevant to the folks who can make, any of those events that they choose to. And just looking at the last GPNP Summit, this is a pretty good overview that we share in our impact report with funders or other community partners that are curious about our work. 66% of our attendees at the last summit serve communities beyond Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, and so looking at that regional footprint for GPNP, that doesn't mean that an organization has an operating facility in Allegheny County, but also in Westmoreland, Butler, Beaver, Fayette, Greene counties, any of the other 11 counties in Southwest PA. There were 4,000 minutes of content that was curated based on regional leaders' needs. Right now we have about 20 sessions that have been submitted for the summit. I'll be sending out a reminder later this week. But really, if you have a topic, an interest, something that you'd like to speak on or definitely want to hear to make that time relevant to you, please feel free to send me an email. We had over 170 presenters, over 83 sessions, including our keynotes and panel discussions. And that was very much a labor of love. On the right side of the screen, you'll see our policy focus areas and the conversations that we had around health, broadband, housing, education, workforce, environment, which has really shaped our monthly public policy committee meetings, but also the research that Craig has been doing and keeping tabs on for the nonprofit sector since January. We had over 1,500 engaged participants over the course of 2 days. So we had, I think, 800 registrants, and of those, only about 100 people, didn't come back for day 2. And so looking at those engagements that happened across the 2 days, the last summit was clearly very worthwhile for our participants, and a lot of that time was spent on opening doors for folks who wouldn't ordinarily be able to attend things like GPNP summits. And so we had, 38 sponsors, 150 scholarships were provided to individuals to attend who wouldn't normally have been able to attend without that. That covered the full cost of their ticket, and there were over 100 discounts. And so if you're looking to, have similar conversations at the end of this year, please plan to join us for the summit. We'll be sending those save the dates out virtually this week, but also next week in the mail. One thing that I did see as a kind of a driver for a lot of our conversations in the policy and advocacy area is looking at what this perception kind of socially of nonprofits or, who are the helpers in community really looks like. And so I wanted to share, Grantmakers shared the article or one of the articles this morning, but Candid and the Center for Effective Philanthropy are really highlighting what we've really known to be true for multiple years, but this is the first time that I've seen something kind of published at the level of, the owners of GuideStar, which is Candid, or, something on the opposite side in the philanthropic sector, where public sentiment is increasingly favoring individual and community responsibility for intervention on addressing societal needs, while nonprofits are facing financial uncertainties, political pressures, and staff burnout that are really minimizing our abilities to be operating at full capacity. And so looking at the memo, which you can find on the Candid website and from Center for Effective Philanthropy, there are a couple of things that are kind of on the horizon that we've talked about a little bit on these calls, but this is the first time I've seen it published in a really succinct way by two separate sources in the same week, and which means it's really kind of a red flag to pay attention to. So one, increased demand on local nonprofits. So as we're seeing public expectations shift away from federal solutions and funding specifically, local nonprofits are likely to experience heightened demand for services and also having to navigate that without increases in their funding. Also, because of that operational strain and program limitation, for how staff burnout is going to be interacting in a really critical way with our ability to maintain our current level of programming. Sorry, my allergies are like really popping off right now. Or expanding services to meet growing community needs. And then finally, a need for strategic fundraising and advocacy. We're seeing a lot of organizations turning to small dollar donation campaigns because they are unrestricted funds. I think that's kind of working around this education and this conversation that Monique spoke to really well, which is re-educating philanthropy and government on what the day-to-day impact of our work really is. And so looking at not working around that to go straight to the small dollar donations. It's more of a yes and strategy of how are we utilizing platforms like Generosity or, cohorts through the Forbes funds to really take that collective impact focus and make sure that we're targeting talking points, fundraising, not around our individual organizations, but around the needs of the community. And so that's an ongoing conversation, that we've been having for at least as long as I've been at the Forbes funds. But the timeline for getting out deliverables and having some of those spaces is really critical because we're hearing the same things and that want to connect differently from philanthropy at scale as well. So some of the key findings from those articles are that, the public expectations are shifting. A lot of Americans believe that helping those in need is primarily the responsibility of individuals and local communities, not the government, which looks at kind of a shift in where services are coming from and how they are funded in a big way. Also, at this time, nonprofits are facing financial uncertainty, and we've seen decreases in individual giving as well, in addition to the federal spending or contracting. We know, everybody on this call, staff burnout as a critical indicator of organizational health and program success, but it is a lot. And when Monique was speaking and saying that happened, the election went the way it did, and we saw some early indicators through Project 2025 of what this might mean to the nonprofit sector. I don't know if anybody anticipated how quickly these things would be changing or how quickly a lot of energy would need to be spent, educating and re-educating elected officials about the work and the impact of our work that we're doing, every single day. And then finally, a desire for stronger funder relationships. A big part of that is not only that education that the nonprofits provide, but an openness to that information from funders to seek more information and work differently from that. And so, what does that look like for unrestricted buckets of funding from funders? What do multi-year commitments look like? And how are we really navigating and organizing that at scale to really increase that transparency and flexibility from the philanthropic sector? So I'm going to kind of go through this very quickly because I would really encourage you to, read the article from Candid and the Center for Effective Philanthropy. But what it comes down to is really collective impact and understanding where does your organization sit in the broader communities that you're serving. What does that mean in terms of community stakeholder engagement? And then as you're diversifying funding resources, rather than thinking about that as a organization specific conversation, what does that mean for diversifying funding resources for the entire community? And so, who's going to be most effective in having that conversation? And a lot of this is going to require building bridges, repairing trust, and some difficult conversations that have been able to be put off in a lot of places where organizations are competing for funds from different funders or different sources. And figuring out a way to navigate that is a space where the Forbes Funds is really great at having those critical conversations and courageous conversations and vulnerable conversations, as Fred calls them, because before doing anything at the policy level, not only organizing talking points, but also having a plan for if those talking points are effective, how those dollars need to be invested differently is a critical juncture at this point that a lot of folks sometimes aren't ready to have those conversations or prioritize them. Looking at the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I did want to go through a couple of things, and thank you, Craig, for sharing a quick overview of this last week when I was out for a training. But this is a comprehensive legislative package that is central to President Trump's second term agenda. So One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA, is the reconciliation package that did pass the House of Representatives. And so this includes, huge tax cuts in line with the Tax and Jobs Act from 2017, increased work requirements for safety net programs like Medicaid and SNAP, cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, irrespective of those increased requirements, increased defense and border spending, raising state and local taxes or the SALT deduction cap from $10,000 to $30,000, and reducing federal spending by about $1.5 trillion over the course of the next 10 years, adding about $3.3 trillion to the national debt. And so in the work requirements portion of this bill, this would mandate that able-bodied adults must work at least 80 hours per month to engage in approved community programs to maintain their Medicaid eligibility. And this is a huge point of contention where there are a lot of folks that are pushing for immediate implementation rather than delayed enforcement to meet fiscal objectives as the primary goal for those conversations. Second, looking at coverage reductions for Medicaid specifically, this could result in about 8.6 million individuals losing Medicaid coverage. I've seen some reports that say anywhere up to 12.2 million individuals. So a huge chunk of our nation's population that would be impacted and losing their coverage. That's not including the about 41% of births that are impacted, covered in part or in whole by Medicaid annually across the entire United States. And so when we're looking at these numbers of 8.6 million or 12.2 million, looking at full coverage, there's a lot of resources that are covered by Medicaid and that a lot of people are not aware of. State funding adjustments, so reducing federal contributions to Medicaid, altering the funding formula that would decrease the federal match, which would increase the state's responsibility or financial burden to cover those services. Looking at how the state budget impacts are going to be very different as well. And then finally looking at the elimination of provider taxes. And that's a mechanism that a lot of states use to fund their share of Medicaid costs. And so this would be an additional strain on the state budgets in addition to having more coverage for that. Right now, there is Senate consideration and conversations at this point because it did pass the House, and then hopefully for a lot of the Senate Republicans, they're looking for a July 4th deadline for presidential approval. It is anticipated that they would do a simple majority vote, which would bypass the 60 majority vote filibuster threshold, and so this is a huge point of contention for a lot of folks, and this is the time to really be calling senators. And if you are not comfortable doing that on behalf of your organization because you don't want to bleed into that lobbying space if you're not an organization that's registered as a lobbying entity, even if you are a 501c3 organization. This is a very easy conversation to have based on here's what the impacts will be. You don't have to tell your senator to vote a certain way or to support or not support. This is an educational conversation, and so sticking to those educational talking points, looking at who's going to be most affected, how this is going to impact your nonprofit organization, urging them to make a smart choice and support community members. That's something that really does lead into that advocacy side of the conversation and steers clear of lobbying. There are a lot of resources if your organization is registered as a lobbying entity and does track those hours that you can look at for additional talking points as well. So, right in line, getting informed on how many of your clients currently use Medicaid, how many of your partner organizations that you're working with are getting support through Medicaid as well for their clients, looking at how your programs through housing, mental health, addiction, food, senior care would be impacted by coverage losses or state funding cuts. And so this, again, isn't looking at that individual program or organization perspective. It's how are the individuals in my community that my organization serves that might also being served by other organizations really going to be impacted by this? Educating stakeholders, and so having those community conversations that Monique talked about, making sure that we're publishing and writing and sharing this information in plain language, using facts and talking about the anticipated impact of the proposed changes, and then advocating locally and federally. So calling or meeting with your members of Congress, especially those who might be on the fence. And so if there are multiple conversations that are showing contention, one way or the other, where this is really an ongoing conversation and negotiation. We also know that there's a reconciliation committee that has to meet if the changes that the Senate makes to the bill are significant enough that it has to have a joint conversation with the Senate and the House, which would push this deadline even further. And so it's still great to reach out to members of the House of Representatives, thank them or urge them to talk to their counterparts and really recognize the impact that this is going to have on those you're serving. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but one thing to mention, since there's a lot of conversation around this and it's a spending bill, I do want to go through very quickly the difference between the reconciliation versus the traditional budget or appropriations bill that is also being discussed. So the reconciliation bill, or One Big Beautiful Bill Act, facilitates expedited consideration of legislation that affects spending, revenues, and the debt limit. This is a budget resolution with reconciliation instructions, not subject to filibuster, so it bypasses the filibuster and only requires a simple majority in the Senate, and it is restricted by budgetary provisions. Non-budgetary items are prohibited under the Byrd Rule. The appropriations bill, which is our typical budget that we see from the federal government every year, is what the agreed annual funding for the federal government operations and programs looks like. This is subject to the standard legislative procedures, which does include potential filibuster and requires a supermajority of 60 plus votes in the Senate. In the Senate, and then this would cover discretionary spending and must be enacted annually to fund government activities. And so, as we're having these two different conversations, in a lot of different places, I've heard reconciliation or budget being used kind of interchangeably, and those are two different processes. And that's why this is so significant, because the reconciliation bill does bypass that filibuster and requires 51 votes, not 60, which is why there's a lot of eyes on this right now. And I'm going to go very quickly through this because I know Craig shared last week, but this is the executive order related to birthright citizenship, a conversation that's being currently heard in the Supreme Court, which is called the Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship executive order that would deny automatic U.S. citizenship to children born on U.S. soil unless at least one parent is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. There have been a lot of articles or interviews in the media about what birthright citizenship means, how it's defined. And so all this to say, I would definitely pay attention to the conversations that are happening in the Supreme Court case. There have been a lot of interesting opinions from members of the Supreme Court on both sides of the political aisle. that have gone through kind of the questioning and the hearings on birthright citizenship. And so looking at, what this is going to mean if upheld or if upheld or not, to educate the community on those conversations and talking points, educate or engage in advocacy, preparing legal support across the entire sector. So looking at an increase in demand for legal services, not only for individuals directly affected by this, but for nonprofit organizations that serve those individuals and need to maybe train staff, volunteers, and nuances of citizenship law and rights, and then also just kind of staying up to date on the decision and then how that gets implemented or how those conversations are happening in our community. I did see something about the mayor of Wilkinsburg issuing an alert after there were reports of ICE in Wilkinsburg over the weekend. And so just looking at what is happening preemptively versus, as this conversation is happening around citizenship is really critical. And then last update I want to focus on this morning, House Resolution 1526. So this is a overview of how it was also introduced as an executive order that was not upheld, but House Resolution 1526 would make it significantly more difficult for nonprofits and civil society or social impact sector to block harmful federal policies before damage is done. And so looking again at a need for increased legal support and understanding within the sector. The courts are a critical avenue for protecting vulnerable populations. So nonprofits are seeing, things that are introduced through executive orders or through bills that impact nationally. And so an injunction is something that can prevent or mandate actions by federal agencies in parties or for parties in a specific lawsuit. Currently, district courts are able to stop federal policies from being enforced nationwide, even if the case involves just one plaintiff or nonprofit. This would shift that power away from the local courts or the district courts, requiring broader decisions to come from appellate level courts. And so it would be kind of a prevention for stopping things like executive orders, and it would make it more difficult to pause or stop the application of legal decisions that would affect federal policies, regulations, large groups, including nonprofits. And so there have been a lot of injunctions from federal courts issued over the course of many presidential terms. And so this is something that would very much shift power away from that branch of government and really control in the executive branch. And so I can share these slides. I don't want to go, too into this. We've been talking about it the last couple of weeks, but just staying informed on legal supports and services. We've got more updates and benefits for members in that space coming up through GPNP membership benefits in the next couple of weeks. We're currently working with a few different partners to have additional briefings and webinars on these critical issues, and also looking at pointing to resources differently. I would also recommend Reimagine Appalachia as a resource, the same way that GPNP has membership and focus on Southwest PA. Reimagine Appalachia focuses on that Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Appalachian region focus, and a lot of the members from those conversations are from West Virginia. And so when we're looking at those, cross-state, interstate conversations, that's a really great resource as well. And I see that Bree launched the poll. Thank you so much for sticking with me this morning. I know this is a longer than average policy update, but these are the really critical high-level items that we've been really paying attention to, watching, and I would encourage you to stay up to date on as well. And if anybody has any questions, please let me know, but have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next Monday.
And again, you can catch the recording of this call on the GPMP member portal. I'm going to pull up our final slide. Thank you so much for joining us. And next week, we will have Naomi Tannenbaum from Public Allies chatting with us. Again, thank you for being here. Good luck this week. We'll see you next Monday. Thanks all.